The morning started like any other in a small, cozy apartment on the edge of the city. Sunlight streamed through the half-open curtains, casting long shadows across the living room. The smell of fresh toast and coffee filled the air. In the kitchen, a man in his early 40s moved quickly but carefully, juggling his briefcase, a cup of coffee, and trying not to spill anything on his shirt. He had the kind of routine that was almost automatic, shaped by years of early mornings, long hours, and the constant responsibility of raising his twin daughters alone. The twins, small but full of life, were already awake, chattering and laughing over breakfast. They were 10 years old, the kind of age where curiosity meets energy, and they had a special bond not just with each other but with their dad. Their eyes would light up every time he entered the room, a small smile breaking across their faces. They were aware, more than most kids their age, of how much he worked and how hard he tried to balance everything. They had watched him rush out in the mornings, tired but determined, and come home in the evenings, still carrying the weight of work and responsibilities. This particular morning felt different to him. There was an unusual tightness in his chest, a mix of anticipation and exhaustion. His company had recently taken on a huge project, and deadlines loomed like dark clouds. Emails, meetings, presentations, and phone calls filled his day, leaving little time for anything else. Even so, he made it a point to have breakfast with the girls, knowing that these moments were precious. As he poured cereal into their bowls, he glanced at their little notebooks lying on the table, filled with doodles and notes about school, their favorite cartoons, and sometimes questions for him about work. It was their way of connecting, even if he didn't always have the time to answer everything in detail. After breakfast, he helped them with small tasks like tying their shoelaces or brushing their hair, and listened to their stories about school. They told him about a science project, a funny incident with a friend, and a story about a stray cat that had been hanging around the park. His tired eyes softened as he listened. Despite the busy life he led, these were the moments he cherished most. The girls noticed their dad's weariness. They saw how he tried to smile but sometimes failed to hide the stress. One of them tugged gently at his sleeve and asked, "Dad, are you going to be okay today at work?" He knelt down to her level, holding both their hands in his. "I will, sweetheart," he said, trying to keep his voice light and reassuring. "It's a busy day, but I'll manage. And I'll be back before you know it." After a quick round of hugs, he kissed their foreheads and grabbed his briefcase. The apartment door closed behind him, leaving the twins staring after him, a mixture of concern and admiration in their eyes. They knew he worked hard, and they respected that, but they also wished there was a way they could help him make things a little easier. Little did they know, they were already hatching a plan. At the office, the Father's Day started with the usual rush. He walked through the glass doors, nodding to colleagues, exchanging quick greetings, and diving into the thick of work. Meetings piled up, emails demanded immediate attention, and phone calls came in back to back. He moved from one task to another, his mind constantly calculating, prioritizing, and problem-solving. He was respected for his efficiency and dedication, often seen as the person who could handle anything thrown his way. Yet, behind the professional exterior, he carried the quiet stress of a single parent who always had to think about home too. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, the twins were busy in their room. They whispered to each other, plotting a surprise for their dad. They had noticed how much he worried about managing everything, and they wanted to do something special. The idea was simple but ambitious. They wanted to take his place in a small way to mimic his office routine at home. It started with drawing little charts and reports, pretending to schedule meetings, and setting up desks with their school supplies arranged like office files. They even dressed in shirts and ties, trying to look like their dad. Their laughter filled the room as they practiced, correcting each other and adding funny touches like making one of their stuffed animals the CEO who gave them instructions. The day went on. At the office, the father faced challenges that required his attention. A project report had errors, a team member was struggling with a task, and a last-minute client call changed the schedule. He navigated everything with his usual skill, but he felt a constant tug of worry for his daughters. He checked his phone occasionally, seeing small messages they had sent, a drawing, a funny sticker, a short note saying, "We miss you, Dad." Each one made him smile, even if it was just for a moment, and reminded him why he worked so hard. As the afternoon sun streamed through the office windows, the twins continued with their preparations. They rehearsed presentations on the living room floor, marking charts with crayons and stapling papers together. One of them took on the role of writing minutes for the meeting. Another acted as the team manager. They made small signs, one reading Dad's desk, another saying important tasks, and lined them up neatly. Their small hands moved with focus and determination, and every so often they exchanged proud glances at how professional it all looked. By evening, the father wrapped up his work, exhausted but feeling accomplished. As he left the office, his mind raced with thoughts about the project, the emails he still had to send, and the meetings he would attend tomorrow. But underneath all that, there was a feeling of anticipation, a subtle hope that coming home would bring relief, joy, and the comfort of his daughter's company. He could not have guessed, though, the surprise that awaited him. The apartment smelled of freshly baked cookies, something the twins had secretly made during the afternoon. The living room was arranged in a way that mimicked his office, with little desks, chairs, and neatly organized files that were actually their homework and drawings. The girls hid behind one of the desks, whispering and giggling as they prepared to greet him in a way he would never forget. When he opened the door, the sight that met him was both shocking and heartwarming. His daughters, dressed like tiny versions of himself, were standing at the desks ready to take on the workday. Their serious expressions, mixed with the innocence of their age, made him pause. He set down his briefcase slowly, his heart swelling with pride and amusement. He could not stop the laughter from escaping his lips as he looked at their tiny charts, the reports they had made, and the little sticky notes that had his name on them. The twins' eyes sparkled with excitement and anticipation. They had been practicing this moment, imagining his reaction, hoping he would feel proud. And now, seeing him laugh and shake his head in disbelief, they knew they had succeeded. The father knelt down, opening his arms for them, feeling a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. It was not just the surprise, it was the love, effort, and thoughtfulness behind it. He hugged them tightly, holding them close, and said in a voice that trembled with emotion, "You too, this means more to me than anything today." For a few moments, the busy world, the deadlines, the stress of work, all of it, faded away. All that remained was the warmth of home, the laughter of his daughters, and the pride he felt in the little hearts that wanted to share his burdens, even if only in play. The apartment was filled with joy, innocent laughter, and the kind of happiness that comes from love and family. It was a small, simple moment, yet it carried weight. It reminded him why he worked so hard, why he tried to be patient, and why every tired morning and long day was worth it. His daughters had given him something that no promotion, bonus, or recognition at work could ever match. The feeling that they understood him, appreciated him, and loved him deeply. And as they settled into their little office roles, talking, pretending, and giggling, he watched with a full heart. The day had been long and exhausting, but in that moment everything felt complete. He realized that while he worked to provide for them, they, in their small way, had given back to him something far more valuable. The twin girls had taken their dad's place, not in work but in spirit, and the joy of seeing that effort unfold in front of him was a memory he would treasure forever. Days turned into weeks, and the protagonist's quiet suburban life had transformed into something entirely unexpected. The mailbox at the edge of the yard, once a simple structure, had become a symbol of persistence, patience, and careful planning. Every morning they would walk out to check the mail with a sense of anticipation, half expecting, half dreading what they might find. There were no letters from a friendly neighbor now, only the looming question of whether the mailbox had survived another night. The latest reconstruction of the mailbox was the strongest yet. Reinforced with a sturdy post, additional screws, and a fresh coat of weather-resistant paint, it looked almost indestructible. The protagonist felt a sense of pride as they stepped back to admire the work. They knew that whoever had been damaging it would now have to put in more effort to break it, and that thought brought a small thrill. This was no longer just about receiving mail. It was about asserting control over a situation that had started to feel chaotic. The tension in the neighborhood had started to shift. The protagonist noticed subtle changes in the way people moved around the street. The neighbor across the street, who had initially appeared polite and ordinary, now seemed to carry an air of defiance. She would glance across the street with a slight smirk, linger just a moment too long, or position herself in a way that suggested she knew she was being observed. The protagonist kept their eyes open, learning the patterns of her movements, trying to anticipate the next incident before it happened. The protagonist decided to take extra precautions. They began documenting everything meticulously. Every morning they would take pictures of the mailbox, noting its condition and any slight changes. Dates, times, and weather conditions were recorded. These details were small, almost obsessive, but they created a clear timeline of the incidents. The protagonist felt a growing sense of empowerment. Knowledge was power, and with each piece of evidence they were becoming more prepared for whatever would come next. Despite the frustration, the protagonist tried to maintain their daily routine. They continued working, interacting with friends and neighbors, and keeping the house in order. But there was an underlying tension, a quiet edge that colored their interactions. Even casual greetings and small talk were now filtered through a lens of vigilance. Every sound in the evening, every movement on the street could be a signal of impending trouble. Attempts to resolve the situation peacefully had failed. When the protagonist approached the neighbor directly, hoping for a calm conversation, it only led to vague denials and a dismissive attitude. The neighbor's responses were polite but evasive, and there was a subtle mockery hidden in the tone. It was clear that words alone would not solve the problem. This realization brought a mix of frustration and determination. The protagonist understood that they needed a different approach, one that combined patience, strategy, and careful observation. With the mailbox now stronger than ever, the protagonist began to observe the street more closely. They noticed small details that had gone unnoticed before: the pattern of streetlights, the movement of cars, the sound of leaves in the wind. These small observations helped them anticipate potential threats. The protagonist began to set up small, discreet ways to monitor the mailbox. Not cameras or alarms, just simple methods that allowed them to gather information without drawing attention. Every detail became a clue. Every moment of observation a step closer to understanding the neighbor's actions. The stress of the situation was not easy to manage. The protagonist found themselves thinking about the mailbox constantly, replaying scenarios in their mind, considering every possible way the neighbor could strike. Friends noticed the change, offering support, advice, or simply a listening ear. Some joked about the obsession, while others shared their own stories of dealing with difficult neighbors. These conversations provided small relief, but they also reinforced the reality of the challenge. The situation could not be solved with mere words or passive acceptance. Nightfall brought a new dimension to the ordeal. The protagonist would sit by the window, watching the street as darkness settled in. The quiet neighborhood, once a source of comfort, now felt charged with potential. Every shadow, every movement became significant. They learned to read the street like a book, understanding the patterns and predicting the likely moments of action. The anticipation was intense, but it also gave a sense of purpose. Waiting, watching, preparing. These actions became a way to reclaim control over the situation. At the same time, there were moments of reflection and humor. The protagonist often marveled at how a small mailbox could create such chaos in a life that had been so ordinary. They thought about the absurdity of standing vigil for a piece of mail infrastructure, yet they understood that it represented something deeper. It was about boundaries, respect, and the quiet assertion of one's rights. The mailbox had become more than an object. It was a symbol of resilience, a small but meaningful battleground in a struggle for dignity. The protagonist's strategy became more refined. They learned to anticipate the neighbor's moves, identifying patterns in timing and behavior. Each night they would watch with patience, waiting for the right moment to act, to gather evidence, or simply to observe. This careful approach allowed them to remain calm, even in the face of repeated provocations. There was a growing sense of confidence that the situation could be handled without resorting to confrontation or aggression. As the days passed, the tension in the street began to ripple outward. Other neighbors noticed the changes, the subtle energy that had shifted in the air. Conversations carried a quiet curiosity, a sense of anticipation. The protagonist, while focused on their own problem, became more aware of the broader dynamics of community life. The situation with the mailbox had opened their eyes to the complexities of human behavior, the ways people test limits, and the importance of standing firm in one's convictions. The protagonist also began to think about the long-term resolution. It was not enough to simply rebuild the mailbox repeatedly. There needed to be a strategy, a plan to finally address the root of the problem. They considered various options, weighing the potential consequences of each. In the end, they knew that patience and careful observation were the most effective tools. Rushing into confrontation could escalate the situation, but measured action could provide clarity and resolution. In the quiet moments, the protagonist reflected on the lessons learned so far. Anger and frustration were natural, but they needed to be channeled into constructive action. The mailbox, though small, had become a teacher, providing insights into resilience, strategy, and the importance of standing one's ground. Each reconstruction, each observation, and each moment of vigilance contributed to a growing sense of empowerment. The protagonist felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that they were taking control of their circumstances with intelligence and patience. Despite the challenges, life continued. Work, social interactions, and daily routines carried on, but the mailbox remained at the center of the protagonist's attention. It was a constant reminder of the struggle, the persistence required, and the eventual goal of resolution. Each day brought new opportunities to learn, observe, and prepare for the eventual confrontation that loomed on the horizon. The tension, anticipation, and careful planning created a narrative of quiet suspense. The protagonist's life, once ordinary, had been transformed into a story of observation, patience, and strategy. The mailbox, though small and mundane, had become the focus of a larger journey, a journey that revealed the complexities of human interaction, the subtle dynamics of neighborhood life, and the power of persistence in the face of repeated challenges. And so, the protagonist continued, day by day, watching, waiting, and preparing. The quiet suburban street, with its tree-lined sidewalks and well-kept houses, had become a stage for a silent drama, where every glance, gesture, and movement carried significance. The mailbox stood firm, a symbol of resilience, and the protagonist's determination grew stronger with each passing day. The story was far from over, and the sense of anticipation, strategy, and quiet triumph continued to shape their experience, keeping them alert, engaged, and ready for whatever would come next. The protagonist had grown more determined with each passing day. The quiet suburban life they once enjoyed was now filled with anticipation and careful observation. They had rebuilt the mailbox stronger than ever, and had become almost a guardian of their own property. Each morning began with checking the mailbox, taking note of its condition, and looking for any signs of tampering. The act had become almost ritualistic, a way of asserting control over the situation that had begun to dominate their daily life. Over time, they noticed that the neighbor's behavior had become bolder. She seemed to take pleasure in her ability to frustrate, her glances more pointed, her presence in the yard more deliberate. The protagonist observed these signs carefully, making mental notes and preparing for the eventual confrontation. They were no longer simply reacting, they were planning, strategizing, and readying themselves for the moment when patience would turn into action. The protagonist had decided that this time, they would catch the neighbor in the act. They spent days preparing, thinking through every possibility, considering how to observe without being seen, and how to gather proof without escalating the situation prematurely. It was a delicate balance requiring patience, attention, and a keen awareness of human behavior. They became almost a detective in their own yard, reading patterns, timing movements, and predicting actions. The mailbox, once a simple piece of metal and wood, had become the focal point of their strategy. They had reinforced it with steel supports, secured it with heavy-duty screws, and ensured that it would withstand almost any attack. But this was not just about physical strength. It was about psychology. The protagonist knew that patience and observation could be more powerful than any tool. They waited, watched, and recorded small details, letting the tension build and allowing the neighbor's impatience to reveal itself. As the days passed, the protagonist became more attuned to the rhythms of the street. They noticed the times when the neighbor would be outside, the subtle movements she made, and the way she seemed to test boundaries without making her actions obvious. They began to see a pattern, a rhythm that allowed them to anticipate when an incident might occur. This knowledge gave a sense of control, a feeling that the situation was no longer entirely chaotic, and that the eventual outcome could be influenced by careful planning. At night, the protagonist would sit by the window, sipping a cup of tea, eyes fixed on the street. The quiet suburban sounds, the rustling leaves, distant car engines, the occasional dog barking, had taken on new significance. Every noise was a clue, every movement a signal. They watched as shadows shifted across the pavement, as cars passed slowly as the neighbor moved in and out of her yard. The suspense was intense, yet there was a strange exhilaration in the careful vigilance. Friends and family noticed the change. They asked questions, offered advice, and sometimes joked about the obsession. The protagonist listened, taking in their words, but remained focused. This was their situation to manage, and while support was welcome, the responsibility fell squarely on their shoulders. They found small moments of relief in conversation, but the overarching focus remained on observation, strategy, and preparation. The protagonist also reflected on the broader implications of the situation. They thought about the nature of boundaries, respect, and the ways in which people assert themselves. The mailbox was a small, tangible symbol of these ideas, but the lessons extended beyond it. They realized that patience, strategy, and careful observation were tools that could be applied to many aspects of life, not just the immediate conflict. Each act of vigilance, each careful note, and each observation became part of a larger understanding of human behavior. One evening, a subtle sign indicated that the neighbor was preparing to act again. The protagonist noticed her moving closer to the mailbox, a deliberate step that suggested intent. Their heart raced, adrenaline surged, but they remained calm. Years of anticipation, planning, and observation had led to this moment. They had waited patiently, gathering evidence, understanding patterns, and preparing for the confrontation that was about to unfold. The moment of action required precision. The protagonist moved quietly, positioning themselves in a spot where they could observe without being noticed. Every muscle tensed, every sense alert. They watched as the neighbor approached the mailbox, the intent clear in her movements. The suspense was almost unbearable, yet it was also a moment of triumph, the culmination of weeks of patience and careful planning. As the neighbor reached for the mailbox, the protagonist acted subtly, capturing evidence and ensuring that the situation could not be denied later. The quiet tension broke in a small, controlled way, enough to confirm what had been suspected without creating unnecessary confrontation. It was a delicate balance requiring both courage and restraint. The protagonist felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that their efforts had paid off, that patience and observation had revealed the truth. In the aftermath of this observation, the protagonist felt a mix of emotions. There was relief knowing that the mystery had been solved. There was satisfaction, a sense of justice in knowing that the actions were deliberate and that they had been prepared. There was also reflection, understanding that this was not just about a mailbox but about boundaries, respect, and the quiet assertion of one's rights. The incident had transformed them, teaching lessons about patience, strategy, and the power of careful observation. The neighbor, unaware that her actions had been recorded, continued her routine, oblivious to the evidence that now existed. The protagonist, meanwhile, felt a growing confidence. They had anticipated, observed, and acted without losing composure. The mailbox remained intact, standing as a symbol of resilience, and the protagonist knew that the next steps could be taken with clarity and purpose. As the story continued, the protagonist became more aware of the dynamics of the neighborhood. Each interaction, glance, and gesture carried new significance. The small suburban street had become a stage for a silent drama, where patience, strategy, and careful observation played critical roles. The mailbox was no longer just a piece of property. It was a symbol of endurance, vigilance, and the quiet power of standing one's ground. The protagonist's life had been transformed by this experience. The routine, quiet days had been replaced by vigilance, anticipation, and careful planning. Yet through this challenge, they had discovered strength, patience, and a deeper understanding of human behavior. The mailbox, though small, had taught lessons that extended far beyond its simple structure. Lessons about respect, persistence, and the value of careful observation. And so the protagonist continued, day by day, watching, waiting, and preparing. The quiet suburban street, once a backdrop for ordinary life, had become a theater for suspense and strategy. The mailbox stood firm, a testament to resilience, and the protagonist knew that the story was far from over. Every day brought new opportunities, new observations, and new insights. all contributing to the eventual resolution and the quiet triumph of patience and determination. The tension in the neighborhood had reached its peak. The protagonist had spent weeks observing, planning, and preparing, and now the moment of confrontation was finally within reach. The quiet suburban street, once calm and ordinary, had become charged with anticipation. Every glance, every movement carried significance, and the protagonist's patience and vigilance were about to pay off. That evening, the protagonist took a position where they could observe without being seen. Shadows stretched across the yard, and the fading light made it easier to remain unnoticed. The mailbox stood at the edge of the yard, sturdy and reinforced, a symbol of all the effort, patience, and planning that had gone into this quiet war. The protagonist's heart raced, but they maintained calm, knowing that timing and composure were crucial. Across the street, the neighbor emerged from her house, moving with a sense of purpose. She approached the mailbox, her actions deliberate and unmistakable. The protagonist held their breath, watching intently, noting every small detail. The anticipation was almost unbearable, but there was a sense of satisfaction as the truth became undeniable. This was no accident. It was intentional, and the protagonist had prepared for this very moment. As the neighbor reached the mailbox, the protagonist acted subtly, capturing evidence of the deliberate destruction. Every movement was calculated, careful, ensuring that the situation could not be denied later. The quiet tension that had built over weeks broke in a controlled way, confirming the suspicions that had plagued the protagonist. There was no room for argument now. The evidence was clear and undeniable. The confrontation that followed was intense yet measured. The protagonist approached the neighbor calmly, speaking with clarity and purpose. There was no shouting, no aggression, only the quiet assertion of truth. The neighbor reacted with a mixture of surprise, denial, and anger. Her attempts to minimize the actions were met with steady composure from the protagonist, who had anticipated these responses and remained prepared. The conversation revealed the depth of the neighbor's frustration and defiance. She had been acting out for reasons that seemed trivial to the protagonist but had been significant to her. Yet the protagonist did not allow this to cloud their judgment. The focus remained on facts, evidence, and the simple truth that repeated acts of destruction were unacceptable. This calm, measured approach created a sense of authority, demonstrating that patience and preparation could overcome intimidation. Neighbors who had observed the situation from a distance began to take notice. Word of the confrontation spread subtly, reinforcing the quiet power of observation and preparation. The protagonist's measured response stood in contrast to the neighbor's aggression, creating a clear narrative of patience, vigilance, and the importance of standing one's ground. The mailbox, still intact, was a silent witness to the entire event, a testament to resilience and careful planning. Throughout this ordeal, the protagonist reflected on the lessons learned. Anger and frustration were natural, but they could be channeled into constructive action. The mailbox, though small, had become a teacher, demonstrating the value of patience, careful observation, and strategic response. Each act of vigilance, each moment of careful planning, had contributed to a growing sense of empowerment. The protagonist felt a quiet triumph, knowing that they had faced the situation with intelligence and composure. The neighbor's reaction evolved over time. Initially defensive, she began to understand that her actions were being observed and documented. The realization brought a mix of embarrassment and anger, yet it also created the possibility for resolution. The protagonist, aware of the delicate balance between confrontation and escalation, maintained a calm demeanor. This approach allowed for a resolution that was both effective and non-confrontational, demonstrating the power of measured action in difficult situations. In the days following the confrontation, the protagonist focused on restoring a sense of normalcy. The mailbox remained intact, standing as a symbol of resilience and quiet victory. The street, once filled with tension and uncertainty, began to regain its calm. Yet the lessons learned remained vivid, shaping the protagonist's understanding of human behavior, boundaries, and the importance of standing firm in one's convictions. The protagonist also reflected on the broader implications of the experience. The mailbox had been a small, tangible object, but it represented much more: boundaries, respect, and the assertion of one's rights. The careful planning, observation, and patient response demonstrated that conflicts could be managed without aggression. that strategy and composure could overcome repeated provocation. These lessons extended beyond the immediate situation, providing insight into human interaction, community dynamics, and personal resilience. As life gradually returned to a more ordinary rhythm, the protagonist maintained vigilance. The mailbox, though no longer under immediate threat, continued to symbolize persistence, preparation, and the quiet assertion of control. Each day brought new opportunities for reflection, observation, and learning. The neighborhood, once a backdrop for routine life, had become a stage for a story of patience, strategy, and the power of careful, measured action. The protagonist's experience had transformed them. The routine of checking the mailbox, observing the street, and documenting patterns had taught patience and attention to detail. The confrontation, handled with calm and strategy, had reinforced the value of measured response over impulsive action. The mailbox, once a simple object, had become a symbol of resilience, vigilance, and personal empowerment. The story of the mailbox and the neighbor was far from trivial. It was a narrative of human behavior, community dynamics, and the importance of standing firm in one's convictions. The protagonist had navigated frustration, tension, and repeated provocation with intelligence and patience, demonstrating that careful observation and strategic planning could lead to effective resolution. The quiet triumph of the protagonist became a testament to the power of vigilance, patience, and measured action. Through this experience, the protagonist had learned valuable lessons about human nature. People test boundaries, assert themselves, and sometimes act out of frustration or defiance. Yet, by remaining calm, observing carefully, and planning strategically, it is possible to address challenges effectively without escalating conflict. The mailbox, a small object at the edge of the yard, had become a teacher, demonstrating resilience, patience, and the quiet power of standing one's ground. As the neighborhood slowly settled, the protagonist continued their daily routine with a renewed sense of confidence. The mailbox stood firm, a silent symbol of all that had been endured and overcome. Each day brought small reminders of the lessons learned and the importance of vigilance, observation, and patience. The quiet suburban street, once a backdrop for ordinary life, had become a stage for a story of resilience, strategy, and the power of careful, measured action. And so life went on, with the mailbox intact and the protagonist's sense of control restored. The neighbor, aware of the careful observation and evidence collected, began to adjust her behavior, and the quiet tension in the street gradually dissipated. The protagonist had faced the challenge with composure, intelligence, and patience, emerging not only victorious in the immediate situation but also wiser, stronger, and more attuned to the subtleties of human behavior. The story of the mailbox had become a story of personal empowerment, resilience, and the quiet triumph of measured action over repeated provocation. After the confrontation, life slowly began to regain its quiet rhythm. The mailbox stood at the edge of the yard, sturdy and intact, no longer a symbol of fear or frustration, but one of triumph and resilience. The protagonist felt a sense of relief, a deep, satisfying knowledge that patience, planning, and careful observation had brought a resolution that words alone could not achieve. The challenge had tested them, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident. The days that followed were a mix of reflection and restoration. The protagonist spent time repairing any minor damages, ensuring that the mailbox remained strong and functional. Each act of maintenance was more than just practical. It was symbolic, a way of reclaiming control over their property and their life. Friends and family noticed the difference in the protagonist's demeanor. Where once there had been tension and worry, now there was calm assurance and a quiet pride. The struggle with the mailbox and the neighbor had changed them, shaping their perspective and teaching valuable lessons about resilience, patience, and strategy. The neighborhood, too, began to adjust. People moved about more casually. Conversations resumed without the underlying tension that had permeated the street. The protagonist noticed subtle changes in the neighbor's behavior. She no longer approached the mailbox with deliberate intent or defiance. Perhaps she had learned a lesson, or perhaps the evidence collected had instilled caution. Either way, the dynamic had shifted, and the protagonist could finally enjoy a sense of peace in their own yard. Reflection on the experience revealed deeper insights. The mailbox had been a small object, but the lessons it provided were significant. It had demonstrated the importance of boundaries, respect, and standing firm in one's convictions. The repeated acts of destruction had been frustrating, yet they provided an opportunity for the protagonist to learn about patience, observation, and strategic thinking. Every repair, every moment of vigilance had strengthened their understanding of human behavior and the subtle dynamics of conflict resolution. Life continued, and with each day, the protagonist found new ways to appreciate the calm that had returned. Morning walks, checking the mail, tending to the garden, and interacting with neighbors. All these simple routines now carried a renewed sense of appreciation. The tension and anxiety of the past weeks made these ordinary moments feel more significant, a reminder of the value of peace and stability. The mailbox, once a source of stress, had become a symbol of perseverance and quiet victory. There were still lessons to be learned, small reminders of the importance of vigilance and patience. The protagonist remained aware of the neighborhood dynamics, observing without obsession, understanding patterns without overanalyzing. Life had not returned entirely to what it had been before, but it had settled into a new balance, one where the protagonist felt more confident, capable, and in control. The challenge had been met, and the victory was both tangible and psychological. As the weeks turned into months, the story of the mailbox became a personal narrative of resilience and strategy. The protagonist often reflected on how such a small object had created so much tension, and yet how it had also provided an opportunity for growth and empowerment. The repeated acts of destruction had forced them to engage with patience, observation, and careful planning. The confrontation had tested their composure, and the aftermath had reinforced the value of calm, measured action. These lessons extended far beyond the immediate situation, shaping the protagonist's approach to challenges in everyday life. The neighborhood returned to its calm routine, but the protagonist's perspective had shifted. Simple walks, interactions with neighbors, and daily chores were now seen through a lens of awareness and appreciation. The struggle with the mailbox had provided an unexpected lesson in resilience, highlighting the quiet power of patience and strategic thinking. The protagonist recognized that challenges, even small ones, could provide profound opportunities for growth, learning, and personal development. The mailbox remained a central symbol. Its sturdy post, reinforced structure, and undamaged appearance were reminders of the journey the protagonist had endured. Every morning, as they approached it to retrieve the mail, there was a sense of quiet satisfaction. The effort, patience, and strategy invested in maintaining it were reflected in its endurance. It had survived repeated attempts at destruction, much like the protagonist had survived the tension and stress of the situation. Together, they represented resilience, vigilance, and the triumph of careful planning over impulsive action. There were moments of reflection on human behavior. The neighbors' actions, though frustrating and disruptive, had provided insights into the ways people assert themselves, test boundaries, and respond to perceived slights. The protagonist had learned to anticipate actions, observe patterns, and respond with composure rather than aggression. These lessons were invaluable, applicable to a wide range of interactions beyond the immediate conflict. Patience, strategy, and careful observation had proven more effective than confrontation, proving the power of measured action in difficult situations. The protagonist also found humor and perspective in the situation. Looking back, it was almost incredible how a small mailbox could create such a dramatic series of events. Yet the absurdity of the situation was balanced by the serious lessons learned. The experience had strengthened their resolve, sharpened their observational skills, and provided a sense of accomplishment that went beyond mere property maintenance. It was a story of quiet triumph, resilience, and the subtle power of preparation and strategy. Interactions with neighbors became smoother. The protagonist was able to engage more confidently, with the assurance that comes from having faced a challenge successfully. The street regained its sense of community, and while the memory of tension remained, it was tempered by the understanding that patience, strategy, and careful observation could bring resolution without aggression. The protagonist had transformed the conflict into a story of empowerment, demonstrating that calm, measured action could overcome repeated provocation. Over time, the protagonist found themselves sharing the story with close friends and family, not in anger or frustration, but as an example of resilience and strategic thinking. The mailbox, once a source of stress, had become a teaching tool, illustrating the value of patience, observation, and careful response. The story inspired reflection on personal boundaries, respect, and the subtle dynamics of human behavior. It was a reminder that challenges, even seemingly small ones, could provide profound opportunities for growth and understanding. As life returned to a more ordinary rhythm, the protagonist maintained vigilance without obsession. They continued to check the mailbox, observe the street, and interact with neighbors with awareness. But the tension and stress of the past had eased. The quiet suburban street, once the setting of anxiety and conflict, had become a place of calm, observation, and quiet confidence. The mailbox stood as a lasting symbol of perseverance, patience, and the triumph of careful, measured action. The story of the mailbox and the neighbor concluded not with drama, but with reflection, understanding, and personal growth. The protagonist had faced frustration, tension, and repeated provocation with composure, strategy, and patience. They had observed, prepared, and acted with intelligence, ultimately achieving resolution and peace. The mailbox, simple and sturdy, had become a symbol of resilience, representing the quiet triumph of careful planning over impulsive action. It stood as a testament to the power of patience, observation, and the enduring strength of personal boundaries. In the end, the protagonist's life returned to a sense of calm and normalcy. The mailbox continued to serve its purpose, unbroken and secure, while the lessons learned from the experience remained vivid. Patience, observation, strategic thinking, and the quiet assertion of one's rights had proven more powerful than confrontation or aggression. The story of the mailbox had become a personal narrative of resilience, empowerment, and the subtle but profound impact of measured action in the face of repeated challenges. And with each passing day, the protagonist moved forward with a renewed sense of confidence, awareness, and the quiet satisfaction of having faced a challenge, endured, and prevailed. Even after the situation with the mailbox had seemed resolved, the protagonist felt a lingering sense of vigilance. The quiet suburban neighborhood, which had once been a backdrop for ordinary life, now held subtle reminders of past tension. The mailbox, standing firm at the edge of the yard, symbolized endurance, patience, and quiet triumph. But it also reminded the protagonist that human interactions could be unpredictable, and boundaries sometimes needed to be actively maintained. The protagonist continued to observe the street, though now with a more relaxed focus. They noticed small details they had previously overlooked: the way leaves rustled in the wind, how shadows moved across the pavement, and the subtle rhythms of neighborhood life. Even ordinary events seemed layered with meaning: a passerby walking a dog, a delivery truck slowing at the curb, the neighbor across the street tending her garden. All of these moments offered insight into the delicate balance of community living. The protagonist had become more attuned to observation, understanding that awareness was not just for protection, but for comprehension of human behavior. Although the mailbox had been preserved from further destruction, the protagonist continued to reinforce it, adding minor adjustments that increased its durability and stability. Each improvement, though small, carried significance beyond the physical act. It was a way of asserting control over their environment and demonstrating preparedness without aggression. This ongoing maintenance reflected a new mindset. Challenges could be met with calm, calculated action, turning potential threats into opportunities for personal growth and learning. Neighbors began to notice a change in the protagonist as well. There was a quiet confidence in the way they moved, an assurance in their interactions. Small gestures, friendly nods, polite conversation over fences, attentive listening, created a sense of respect that was earned rather than demanded. The protagonist understood that resilience was not only about defending property, but also about demonstrating composure, intelligence, and thoughtful engagement. The mailbox, though still a central focus, had transformed into a symbol of personal integrity and strategic patience. Over time, the protagonist reflected on the lessons learned from the prolonged conflict. The repeated mailbox incidents had taught patience, careful observation, and the importance of strategic planning. They had learned to anticipate human behavior, to recognize patterns, and to respond without letting anger or frustration dictate actions. The experience had reinforced the value of maintaining personal boundaries and the quiet power of calmly asserting them when tested. Each day of vigilance had strengthened these skills, creating a sense of empowerment that extended beyond the immediate situation. Life gradually settled into a comfortable rhythm. The protagonist resumed their daily routines, checking the mailbox, tending to the garden, walking through the neighborhood, but now these activities were imbued with a heightened awareness. Every movement, glance, and interaction carried lessons in perception and understanding. The protagonist appreciated the ordinary moments more fully, recognizing the subtle intricacies of community life that had previously gone unnoticed. Awareness and mindfulness had become part of daily practice, making each day both ordinary and profound. The neighbor across the street remained a presence in the protagonist's life, though the dynamic had shifted. The previous tension had dissipated, replaced by a cautious civility. The neighbor no longer displayed overt hostility toward the mailbox or the protagonist, though subtle gestures and glances suggested she was aware of the protagonist's attentiveness. This change highlighted a new understanding. The careful assertion of boundaries coupled with strategic observation could influence behavior without direct confrontation. The protagonist had transformed the situation into one of quiet control, where awareness and preparation maintained peace. At the same time, the protagonist explored the psychological aspects of the experience. They considered the motivations behind the neighbor's actions, the dynamics of conflict in shared spaces, and the ways individuals test boundaries. These reflections deepened their understanding of human behavior and social interaction, providing insights that extended beyond the immediate conflict. The mailbox, once a source of frustration, had become a lens through which the protagonist could explore broader truths about patience, strategy, and resilience in everyday life. The protagonist also began sharing these insights with close friends and family, using the mailbox as a metaphor for personal boundaries, vigilance, and strategic response. Conversation shifted from frustration to reflection, exploring the lessons learned and the ways in which small challenges could provide significant personal growth. The story became not just about defending property, but about cultivating composure, observation skills, and thoughtful engagement with others. It was a narrative of empowerment and self-awareness, illustrating the subtle impact of strategy and patience in human interactions. Even routine tasks took on new meaning. Retrieving mail, once a simple chore, became an exercise in mindfulness and observation. The protagonist noticed the patterns of mail delivery, the way different people moved through the neighborhood, and the interactions that occurred along the street. These observations were not motivated by fear or suspicion, but by a desire to understand, to be prepared, and to appreciate the complexities of daily life. Each ordinary moment became an opportunity for reflection, learning, and personal growth. The mailbox itself, now a symbol of endurance and strategy, remained a point of focus. Its sturdy post, reinforced structure, and carefully maintained appearance reminded the protagonist of the journey they had undertaken. Each reinforcement, each careful observation, each moment of patience was embodied in this small, seemingly ordinary object. It was a tangible representation of perseverance, vigilance, and the quiet assertion of personal boundaries, a reminder that preparation and composure could transform potential conflict into a lesson in resilience. Over time, the protagonist's confidence grew. They engaged with neighbors more freely, participated in casual conversations, and navigated the street with awareness rather than tension. The sense of vigilance was no longer oppressive. It had become a natural part of life, a source of assurance rather than anxiety. The protagonist had transformed a challenging situation into an opportunity for growth, learning, and empowerment, demonstrating the value of patience, strategy, and observation in daily life. The lessons from the mailbox extended into other areas of life. The protagonist approached work, social interactions, and personal challenges with the same calm, strategic mindset developed during the conflict. They understood the importance of observation, patience, and measured action, and applied these principles to relationships, decisions, and problem-solving. The experience had provided a framework for navigating uncertainty and conflict, highlighting the power of composure, strategy, and thoughtful engagement.